All right. Hello and welcome. Good morning. Welcome to Radical Action Circles, where we are working to build a collective of people-powered, justice-demanding peace warriors. It is April. It's Autism Acceptance Month, and this month our conversation and our action planning is focused on anti-racist and anti-ableist action. This is the first gathering of our 4-gathering cycle. And it's during this time of the month that we set our intention. So this is the new moon is on the 12th. And this is the time of the month where, we set intentions, we really focus our thoughts and actions in one direction, and then work towards actions in alignment with those values and intentions. Today is also National Siblings Day and National Farm Animal Day. So if you have any siblings or farm animals that you'd like to celebrate, we can lift them up as well. Our work, we have our monthly podcast, Tipsy Unicorns, that we do. We have some partnership shows with the Beautiful Human Social Change Cast, as well as others that are published on our own channel. It's a place where we center voices of those impacted by our oppressive systems. We listen to their stories, we hear their perspectives on oppression and liberation, and learn what drives them to action. And then during our weekly action circles, this is where we fuel our heart connections with our unicorns and kraken. We provide a vessel for emerging activists to learn and grow. We have our 3-step plan, which is to fucking listen, be radical, and take action, because we believe that the stories we hear influence the conversations we have, which drive the actions we take. And everybody who joins us, no matter if they're here once or many times, by being here, you are accepting the AO No More challenge, which means that you are dedicated, just like us, to dismantling systems of oppression, supporting each other in our learning, flipping the script on our concerns, no longer co-signing other people's bullshit, behaving like we say we want to, getting shit done, not accepting or being AOs, getting our poops in groups, and taking effective action in the service of creating a more just, equitable, and peaceful world. You are here and you are committing to action in the service of our shared value of anti-oppression activism. All day, air day. We have our four gatherings in our cycles. The first gathering is in alignment with the new moon. This is when we set our intentions, when we listen to some stories and perspectives and share our reflections and questions and committed actions. Our second gathering, which will be next weekend, is in alignment with the first quarter moon. This is the waxing moon. This is when we're exploring possibilities and considering the stories that we've heard and what we could be doing better in our worlds to be better accomplices in this work. Our third gathering, which is in alignment with the full moon, this is when we make decisions and we seal our intentions. And then the fourth gathering, the final gathering, is when we are taking action. This is in alignment with the third quarter moon, when the moon is waning and we are putting forth the work and surrendering our intentions. So we thank you for being here. At the beginning of every circle, we review our agreements when we have our conversations, and we use what is called the circle way model, where sometimes we will be sharing our perspectives through Talking Peace Council, where each person will have an opportunity to share. Sometimes we will be engaging in silent reflection, silent council, when we take moments to ourselves to free think or free write about our reflections or questions. And then we'll have time to share through Conversation Council, where anybody can talk and share their perspective as things come up. But we all in here have specific agreements about how we show up and how we communicate our own personal perspectives. So we agree to share stories in ways that protect, uplift, inspire, and empower others. We listen for understanding, we're mindful of our impact, and we take responsibility for any hurts we might cause. We are committed to learning and unlearning so we can be more impactful with our actions. We encourage people to pause to gather their thoughts or focus. So sometimes when we're speaking, we might start kind of carrying off into a tangential thought. And so sometimes we might find ourselves wanting to call ourselves or others out in a gentle and supportive way with waste. Why am I still talking? Or Gilmo, good enough. Let's move on. Throughout the circle, we gather gems or quotes harvested by our scribes. That's anybody here. You can, if you hear something that you want to kind of capture, we have Alex does our notes and wonderful notes, and he can add those little quotes to the notes. If the turn comes to you to speak and you would like to pass, you are always welcome to do that. And we attempt to use as much sound verbal behavior as we can, which is measured, deliberate speech. So the impact of our messages matches the intention. We have a few honored guests in the works that will be joining us on the podcast. But I don't want to make any specific announcements yet until I have confirmed dates in the books. But please, if you follow us on Facebook at Cruising with Babs or Instagram at AFAPW, or you can also sign up for our newsletter to stay tuned for updates. So what I wanted to do today to kind of get us oriented and get us started within this conversation is to share some of my reflections based on the work that I've been doing, the learning and the listening, and just to kind of get us started with the conversation on anti-ableism. So the first person I want to talk about, and I put up here our featured story, The Masked Historian, and Alex will get that reference. So the Harry Hirsch is actually a close personal friend, sworn brother of Alex, who wrote the book Earthling People of the Dawn. And this is a book I had read a while back. And the other day, so Harry is one of the people who will hopefully be featured as an honored guest and on the podcast in the next couple weeks. And I woke up the other morning at 1 o'clock and couldn't get back to sleep. And when that usually happens, I know that there's something that I'm thinking about, but haven't necessarily put words to yet. And I thought about it and I was like, I really, in preparation for this cycle, I really am compelled to reread that book, reread Earthlings, People of the Dawn, the first one, which is the ambassador's voice. Because I had, remembered it, but didn't um, I couldn't remember specifics. And so I reread it and I was like so thankful that I had that, I was compelled to do that and read that book. So in it was, there's a very, it's a really cool look at how we show up in the world and the way that different people, their different perspectives and how people show up and what they need and what support looks like, and getting, kind of getting what you need. And there's also, so Alex is one of the people who contributed to the book with some advisement and editing skills. And in he uses the mindsets as a way to kind of illustrate how we can go about like changing our perspective. And I'm probably not doing it justice. I'm not always the best summarizer about these kinds of things. But I would definitely encourage you to look for that book. I have it on Kindle, and read it. It's a pretty quick read, but it's very, yeah, I would encourage you to check that out and reflect upon the connections between that story and this conversation we're having during Autism Acceptance Month of kind of anti-ableism and how that narrative, kind of this fictional narrative, ties into the work that we're doing, and how you kind of use that narrative um, to support your efforts. And then um, I also wanted to introduce and talk about the Facebook group Advocate, Dismantle, Rebuild. That is the Anti-Ableism 101. They have a lot of self-education units to learn more about anti-ableism and starting our listening journey. And so their learning units are really comprehensive and and important to kind of build that foundation. And then what's even more wonderful about this group is the conversations that are being had and the way that they're being had. And the space that they have worked to create is um, a very a very supportive environment that is, I think, that is going to be helpful for us all in this work. So I wanted to share some of my own reflections. There was a conversation that happened the other day. There was a couple different threads, and um, there were some specific things that people said that struck me as messages that we need to hear and we need to center as we start kind of start this cycle and start setting our intentions. Because what we generally do on this day, the first gathering of the cycle, is to kind of start our listening and then begin by posing specific questions that are connected to what we already know, what we want to know, and what other questions that we have, so we can really kind of that can drive what we do outside of this group, the reading that we do, the conversations that we have. So here's what I heard when I was reading through and engaging in some of those posts. I heard that the community that we're centering is focusing and wanting others to focus on decreasing ableism. There's a push for the promotion of neurodiversity and centering the stories of those being hurt. There's been a lot of conversation within that group about behavioral scientists in particular who serve autistic people, and being very defensive when it comes to having these conversations, because they're very hard conversations to have, because it requires us to self-reflect and admit some things that are probably painful to admit as individuals. So there was this call for people to stop responding to these calls to action with saying things like, not my ABA, like, oh, that's not what I do. Because what that is perceived as, the impact of that response is that we are simply abdicating our ethical responsibility to to do no harm, and then to also hold each other accountable for doing no harm. Because when we respond that way, it's dismissive. Like we're trying, that response is indicating that we don't care to listen. We don't see that there are problems, even if we believe that nothing that we have done, like we have done no wrong. When we stop to think about it or I'll take ownership of my own perspective. When I stop to think about my own practice and my own education and things that I have, things that I have witnessed or things that I have personally done, like I can start to see those patterns. And the reason why we're here and the reason why we are having these conversations is that we need to begin to look deeper, and rather than having that initial kind of emotional response of like, nope, I don't want to have this conversation. That's not me. Um, it is, kind of flipping the script and kind of changing the narrative and changing our approach. Um, as behavioral scientists, especially those of us, and I've, kind of begun to notice this pattern of the behavioral scientists that I see who are beginning to kind of rise to the surface and kind of bubble to the top are those ones who themselves have experienced some form of oppression. And I think that's an interesting thing just to note, because it, what I've experienced personally is that, um, I've kind of developed this drive to hold myself to a higher standard, and I see that in others as well. Is that, we know better, not just because we've seen it and we've done it, but because we've lived it. And there's that intersectionality between, or, amongst an interconnection between different forms of oppression, um, that kind of um, that we need to be aware of and kind of helps define the context in which we're acting. Kind of the major thrust of the group, the uh, ADR 101, or the anti-ableism 101, is really trying to get to this point, or, that no matter what you're doing, no matter what you think you've done, or no matter how good or how good you think you are, no matter how far you've come, that as long as there's still abuse and neglect happening in the world, our work is not done. And so, so we must continue to take steps forward. We must continue to take accountability, listen, reflect, and self-educate, um, until um, until we've reached our final goal, which the ultimate goal has definitely not been reached, as can be seen in many places in the world. So there was a conversation kind of that began to happen within one of those threads, in that group, and someone started to ask the questions about, okay, now that we've established that, um, this is this is a problem, the applications of behavioral science and, ABA to um, the two autistic individuals, um, is it's problematic. The question then became, what practices are acceptable? And what was interesting to me when that came up, when that question came up, was that, um, the response was that, well, we're still dealing with all of our defensiveness, and we're not ready to have this conversation yet. Not ready to talk about what we should do yet. We're kind of stuck in this part. We're stuck in this part of the conversation about like what we shouldn't do. And that, before we can move forward, we need to own up to the harm that we've caused, before we can talk about what we can do instead. And I had a emotional reaction to this, because that's what I agree that we need to take ownership, and we need to kind of admit our wrongdoings, and acknowledge the pain that has been caused, right? That's one of our agreements as well in this group. Um, uh, but I guess my thought was like, okay, yes, that's true. So there are some of us who are already there. Like we're already like acknowledging the harms that we've caused. Could we do better? Could we make that more like widely heard? Absolutely. But I think that's what I would like this group to be, kind of be a kind of leader in that effort to be a space where we can own up to our harms and then pivot towards the action and developing those plans that are going to be focused on kind of changing the narrative. So there were a couple kind of specific things that were offered up as suggestions, as things to do, places to look for, some acceptable practices that could be considered when developing kind of the guidance, if you will, for kind of how to shift our practice into something that's going to be more acceptable to the community, autistic community. So the first was to check out the Therapist Neurodiversity Collective. They are, very like it's very clear that they are against applied behavior analysis, and their suggestions and kind of what what they talk about in terms of approaches is very much in alignment with a more person-centered approach to support and programming, which is, again, that's where a lot of people, or there's a strong group of people who are behavioral scientists who are working toward to making that pivot. There was a suggestion to listen to the podcast Two Sides of the Spectrum. So we'll kind of put those out there as suggestions for us. To really consider strength-based evaluation and goals rather than deficit-based, which has been kind of a focus of a lot of people in practice. Focus on providing adequate supports to aid success, as opposed to putting the impetus of change on the people. And to incorporate interests into the supports and promote positive self-identity. So these were kind of these are the general suggestions for how our practices need to pivot and change. And this is where I think that the work of, the work that I was mentioning earlier, that, Tony Biglin and their, Values to Action are doing, is really trying to work to identify the systems and approaches that could be integrated into what we're doing, that would meet all of these criteria for not just the autistic community, but the larger community of people who have been systematically oppressed and historically neglected by our systems. So the kind of the guiding questions and the reflection questions that I wanted to have put out there as to kind of get us centered are the following: is what is ableism? How can we operationally define it? What does it look, sound, and feel like? How will you know when you've witnessed it? How are the problems in the educational, mental, and behavioral health systems related to male dominance and white supremacy? And where are biases evident in our systems, and how could we course correct? So those are the I want to kind of put those out there as our kind of a starting point to get us oriented and to set our intentions. Um, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of silent self-reflection. And I just want to, okay. So we're going to be talking about, sorry, my brain's a little all over the place. So what we're going to be talking about is how this is showing up in our lives. what I want you to kind of think about in your first self-reflection, and so if you have a piece of paper to write on or something to type on, or if you just want to freely think about this, is what questions you have about ableism. What do you know? What do you think you know? What have you experienced? And then what questions do you have? And this will be very helpful in getting us centered, um, and getting our conversation focused. And it will also help with guiding the conversations that I have with our honored guests during the podcast, so I can kind of gather that information and in order to share that with the crew here. Um, the song that I've chosen for today is DMX, and so DMX died yesterday from drug overdose. Um, and so I thought it would be kind of timely to kind of bring in this song as a center of our reflection. So we'll just take a few minutes. We'll listen to a song together, and then engage in some reflections. And you can kind of focus on this STEM question. I'm curious. So, what are you curious about, in particular when it comes to ableism, and then also intersectionalities with racism. I had so Danielle Bill was a guest on our show or on the podcast, and one of our honored guests for last month's cycle. And I spoke to her yesterday, and she shared with me some pretty heavy things that have been going on in her life, that highlight the continued issues that we have in our systems with um, ableism and intersectionality with racism. One of her, uh, the people that she serves, um, the family there was a behavioral crisis, emotional crisis that the family was having. They chose to call the police to intervene. Um, and within 3 minutes of the sheriff department being called, the person was shot, and the family was put in handcuffs in the back of the vehicle, due to a situation that did not have to be the outcome. That was not the response. So this is all very raw and very real, and we see this happening. We see this happening on a regular basis, and is again why we're here. So let's get curious, and we'll come back in a few minutes and do our introductions and share some thoughts and reflections and our questions that we have.